1. Friday, December the 22nd, 1950. A heavy winter rain drummed on the skylight above the bed. The war had ended only 5 years ago, and most of London's neighbourhoods were still scarred from the Blitz. Fewer products were rationed now. Although it had been a few years since the war ended, it was recent enough to serve as a reminder of the days when almost everything was rationed. Alice was spending the evening at home with her motley group of friends. Carol had been an army nurse and now worked at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The 3 men were aspiring jazz musicians. Sam was an excellent bassist and sold books at Harrington & Sons. Anton played the trumpet like nobody else could, but worked as a carpenter. Eddie scraped by singing for coins at Victoria Station and in pubs, when they would let him, that is. It was Eddie who suggested that they should celebrate the coming of Christmas by taking a trip to Brighton the following day. The amusement park on the pier was open again, and the carnival would be at its best on the Saturday before the holiday. They each counted up what little they had. Eddie had earned some money in a bar in Notting Hill. Anton had received a modest year-end bonus from his boss. Carol didn't have a penny, but then she never did, and her friends were used to paying for her. Sam had just sold an American Woman a first edition of The Voyage Out and a second edition of Mrs. Dalloway, which had been enough to make a week's wages in a single day. Alice had worked hard the entire year. She had some savings and felt she deserved to spend them. Besides, she could rationalise the expense to spend time with her friends and escape the solitude of her flat. The wine Anton had brought was corked and tasted like vinegar, but they had all drunk enough of it to start singing. They got louder with each song until Mr. Daldry, Alice's grouchy neighbour across the landing, came and knocked on the door. Sam was the only one brave enough to answer. He promised the noise would stop immediately, as it was time for everyone to go home, anyway. Mr. Daldry accepted their apology, but not before haughtily insisting that he was trying to get some sleep. The Victorian house they lived in had no business turning into an amateur jazz club. It was already unpleasant enough to have to overhear every word of their conversations through the paper-thin walls. Alice's friends packed up to go. They promised to meet up at Victoria Station for the 10 o'clock train to Brighton the next morning. Once they had left, Alice tidied up the room that, depending on the time of day, served as her workplace, dining room, and bedroom. She was just turning down the bedspread when she stood and looked indignantly toward Mr. Daldry's flat. Where did he get the nerve to break up such a lovely evening? What right did he have to interfere? She put on a shawl and then took it off, deciding it made her look too motherly. She went and knocked on Mr. Daldry's door and waited, hands on her hips. "Please tell me the house is on fire, and you've come to save me from the flames," he said sarcastically, when he finally came to the door. "First of all, 11 is not that late on a Friday night, and second of all, I put up with your blasted scales often enough for you to tolerate a little noise on the rare occasions I have some friends over. Your noisy friends are here every week, and they have a regrettable habit of mixing song and drink. It affects my sleep." He raised an eyebrow to underline this last point, before continuing. "And I'm not the one with the piano. Maybe it's the woman downstairs. I'm a painter, not a musician. If you only knew how quiet this house was before you arrived." "What exactly do you paint, Mr. Daldry?" "Urban landscapes." "I never had you down as a painter. I imagined—" "What did you imagine, Miss Pendelbury?" "Oh, call me Alice. You ought to know my name if you really hear all my conversations. Now that we've been officially introduced, would you mind terribly if I went back to bed?" Alice glared. "What is the matter with you?" she asked. "I beg your pardon?" "Why do you insist on being so distant and hostile? We're neighbours. We could try to get on, or at least pretend." "My life here used to be peaceful, Miss Pendelbury, but ever since you moved into that flat, which I myself had hoped to rent, I haven't had a moment's rest. Need I remind you how often you've come knocking on my door, asking for some salt or some flour, or a bit of margarine when you're cooking for your charming friends, or a candle when there's a blackout? Have you considered that your intrusions might bother me? You wanted my flat. I wanted to turn it into a studio. You're the only one in the building with a skylight, but alas, you won over the landlord with your feminine wiles. I have to make do with what little light comes through my tiny windows. I never met the landlord. I rented through an agent. Can we just leave it at that? Is that why you've always been so cold? Because I took the studio you wanted? Miss Pendelbury, the only coldness I feel right now is in my poor feet. If you don't mind, I'm going to go to bed before I catch something. I hope you have a good night's sleep. Mr. Daldry shut the door in Alice's face. What an unpleasant man, she muttered under her breath. I heard that, called Mr. Daldry from inside his flat. Good night, Miss Pendelbury. Alice returned to her flat, washed her face, and went to bed. Mr. Daldry was right about the cold. Winter clutched the old house in its grasp, and the feeble heating did little to raise the temperature. She took a book from the stool that served as her bedside table and read a few lines before putting it down again. She turned out the light and waited for her eyes to adjust to the dark as she watched the rain stream across the skylight. Alice shivered and began dreaming of the forest, the wet earth, and the decomposing autumn leaves in the beech groves. She inhaled, and the smell of the forest floor filled her nostrils. Alice had a rare gift. She was a nose. Her sense of smell was so acute that she could distinguish and memorize the slightest odour. She spent her days alone, bent over the long wooden table in her flat, blending different essences to obtain combinations that might one day become a perfume. Every month she made the rounds of the London perfume shops, offering them her new creations. The previous spring she had convinced a shop in Kensington to produce a scent she called Eau d'Églantine. The perfume had become relatively popular among the shop's upper-class clientele, and it brought in a little money every month. For the time being, it allowed her to live better than she had in previous years. Alice couldn't sleep. She turned on the light, went to her table, and set to work, dipping strips of blotting paper into the little bottles and vials, spreading them in a fan under her nose, and taking notes until late into the night. When the alarm clock woke Alice the following morning, the sun was shining in her eyes, veiled only slightly by the morning mist. She groaned and turned over, before remembering she was supposed to meet her friends at the station. In a single bound, she was out of bed and rifling through her wardrobe before taking a quick sponge bath. On the way out of the door, Alice glanced at her watch and realized she'd never make it in time if she took the bus. She hailed a cab and told the driver to be quick. A long queue was snaking in front of the ticket windows when she arrived at the station. She only had 5 minutes before the train left for Brighton. Alice ran to the platform instead. Anton was waiting outside the first carriage. "For heaven's sake, where have you been?" "Climb in," he said, helping her up into the carriage. She joined her waiting friends in the compartment they had chosen for themselves. "What are the chances our tickets will be checked?" she asked them, falling into a seat, completely out of breath. "I'd give you my ticket, if I had one," said Eddie. "1 in 2?" guessed Carol. Sam was more optimistic. "On a Saturday morning, I'd say more like 1 in 3. Anyway, we'll see when we get there." Alice rested her head against the window and closed her eyes. Brighton was an hour away, and she slept the entire trip. At Brighton Station, a railway official was checking the passengers' tickets as they left the platform. When it was Alice's turn, she pretended to search her pockets. Eddie imitated her. Anton smiled and handed each of them a ticket. He took Alice by the waist and led her into the station's main hall. "Don't ask me how I knew you'd be late. You're always late, and you know as well as I do that Eddie never buys a ticket. I didn't want the day to be ruined before it even began. Alice took 2 shillings from her pocket and offered them to Anton, but he closed her hand around them. "Your money's no good here," he joked. "The day's going to fly by, and I don't want to miss a moment of it." Alice watched him amble off ahead of her and smiled, as she had a brief vision of the teenage Anton she had once known. He turned back and asked if she was coming along. They walked down Queen's Road to West Street and toward the promenade that ran along the seafront. The crowds were thick. 2 long piers extended out over the waves, and the wooden buildings perched along their lengths made them look like 2 hulking ships. The carnival was on Palace Pier. Alice and her friends soon found themselves standing beneath a tall clock that marked its entrance. Anton paid for Eddie's and Alice's tickets again. "You can't pay for me the entire day," she whispered to him. "And why not, if it makes me happy?" "Because there's no reason to." "Do I need a reason, if it makes me happy?" "What time is it?" asked Eddie. "I'm hungry." A few steps away, in front of the large building that housed the Winter Garden, was a fish and chip stand. The smell of fried food and vinegar wafted in their direction. Eddie rubbed his stomach and took Sam over to the stand with him. Alice made a face, but joined them in the end. Everybody placed their orders, and Alice paid. She smiled at Eddie as she passed him a piece of fried fish wrapped in newspaper. They ate their lunch by the balustrade. Anton silently watched the waves lapping at the pilings below, while Eddie and Sam went over their plans for reorganizing the world. Eddie's favourite pastime was disapproving of the government. He accused the Prime Minister of doing nothing to help the poor, and criticised him for not rolling up his sleeves and getting to work on the construction projects that were needed to rebuild London. The way he saw it, they just needed to hire everybody who was out of work, and the problem would be solved. Sam tried to reason with him about the economy, and argued that it was too difficult to find properly trained workers. When Eddie yawned with uninterest, Sam lost patience and called him a lazy anarchist, much to Eddie's pleasure. During the war, they had served side by side in the same regiment. Their bond of friendship was unbreakable, in spite of their differing political opinions. Alice stood to the side of the group, trying to stay upwind of the fried fish. Carol joined her, and they stood in silence, watching the shore. Carol spoke first. "You should be more careful with Anton." "Why? Is something wrong?" Alice asked. "He's lovesick for you. You must be blind to have not noticed." "But we've known each other since we were kids." "I'm just asking you to be careful," Carol interrupted. "If you have feelings for him, there's no need to beat around the bush. We'd all be happy to see the 2 of you together. You deserve each other. But if it isn't the case, you shouldn't be such a tease. You're making him suffer for nothing." Alice turned her back to the men and faced Carol. "How am I a tease?" "Well, for one, by pretending not to notice that I fancy him." Carol threw the remains of her chips into the water, where 2 seagulls greedily wolfed them down. Sam called over to them. "Are you just going to stand there and watch the tide come in, or are you coming with us? We're going to take a look at the games. I saw a booth where you can win a cigar if you're strong enough." He rolled up his sleeves in anticipation. The game cost a farthing a turn. The idea was to use a sledgehammer to hit a mark on the floor that sent a little lead weight flying up a tube. If the weight struck the bell hanging 7 feet above the ground, you won a cigar. A cheap cigar, it was true, but Sam thought smoking cigars the height of dignified virility. He tried 8 times, 2 pennies worth, and twice what he would have spent for a cigar of the same quality at the tobacconist's down the pier. "I'll show you how it's done, if you'll pay," said Eddie. Sam handed him a coin and stood back. Eddie swung the sledgehammer with ease, the weight hit the bell, and the man running the game gave him his prize. "This one's for me," said Eddie. "Give me another farthing, and I'll win one for you." A minute later, they were lighting Eddie's prizes. Eddie was in 7th heaven, and Sam was calculating how much money he had lost. He could have bought a pack of cigarettes. 20 embassies for one bad cigar. It made one think. The men exchanged knowing glances when they came to the bumper cars. Almost immediately, they were each in their own car, flooring the accelerators and smashing into one another as hard as possible. The women watched from the sidelines in amused incomprehension. At the end of the round, they dragged Carol and Alice to a shooting parlour. Anton's aim was the best, and he hit the bullseye until he won a little porcelain teapot for Alice. While this was going on, Carol was absent-mindedly gazing at the carousel, with its old wooden horses turning beneath the wreaths and garlands of coloured lights. Anton came up behind her and took her by the arm. Carol sighed. "I know it's a kid's thing, but would you believe me if I told you I'd never ridden on one?" "Not even when you were little?" asked Anton. "I grew up in the country, and the fair never stopped in our village. When I finally came to London to study, I was already too old, and then the war came and now you want to go for a ride. Follow me." Anton took Carol to the ticket booth. "Your first wooden horse is my treat. Go on, get on that one," he said, pointing to a horse with a brassy blonde mane. "The others look a little skittish, and I think it's best to choose a reliable mount your first time." "You're not coming with me?" asked Carol. No, not me. Just looking at them makes me dizzy. But I promise I won't take my eyes off you." A bell rang, and Anton stepped down from the platform as the merry-go-round began to turn. Sam, Alice, and Eddie came over to watch Carol. She was the only adult in the middle of a ride full of children. By the second turn, tears were streaming down her cheeks, in spite of her efforts to brush them away. "Nice going," said Alice to Anton, punching him in the arm. "I don't understand. She said she wanted to go on the ride with you, not public humiliation." "He said he didn't do it on purpose," said Sam, butting in. "Why don't the two of you act like gentlemen for a change, instead of just standing there?" Alice said. While Sam and Anton were still bickering about who should rescue Carol, Eddie had already jumped on the turning carousel and made his way up through 2 rows of horses until he reached her. "In need of a groom, milady?" he said, resting his hand on the horse's mane. "Oh, please, Eddie, just help me down from here." But instead, Eddie hopped in the saddle behind her, squeezed her in his arms, and leaned over to whisper in her ear. "What's all this? Where's the strong Carol I used to know? You shouldn't forget that when I was loafing around in pubs, you were carrying stretchers under the bombs. The next time we turn past our friends, I want you laughing like a fool." "How do you expect me to do that, Eddie?" asked Carol with a hiccup. "Well, if you think you look silly on this nag in the middle of all these kids, just imagine me here behind you with my terrible cigar and my newsboy cap." On the next turn, they were both chuckling as though nothing had happened. To show he was sorry for abandoning Carol, Anton bought everyone a round of beer at the refreshment stand. While they were drinking, Alice noticed a sign announcing that Harry Groombridge and his orchestra were playing in the old theatre that had been transformed into a cafe after the war. "Shall we go?" she asked the others. "What's stopping us?" said Eddie. "We'd missed the last train, and I don't fancy the idea of sleeping on the beach this time of year," Sam said. "Oh, I don't think so," said Carol. "When the first set is over, we'll still have half an hour to walk back to the station. It's cold, and a little dancing would warm us up. What could be merrier, just before Christmas?" The men didn't have a better idea, and Sam quickly realised that the tickets were only 2pence. If they didn't go dancing, his friends would want to have dinner in a pub, which would be far more expensive. The hall was full of people eager to hear Harry Groombridge and his men. Nearly everybody was dancing. Anton took Alice and pushed Eddie into Carol's arms. Sam watched the 2 couples from an amused distance. As Anton had predicted, the day had flown past. When the orchestra stood up and bowed, Carol made a signal to her friends that it was time to head back. They manoeuvred their way through the crowd to the exit. The lantern swinging in the breeze of the winter night made the pier seem like an ocean liner, steaming full speed ahead into an ocean it would never cross. Alice and her friends were almost off the pier when they noticed a fortune-teller smiling at them from her small caravan. "Have you ever wondered what the future has in store for you?" asked Anton. "Never," said Alice. "I don't believe in that kind of thing. At the beginning of the war, a fortune-teller told my brother he'd stay alive as long as he moved house," said Carol. "He'd forgotten all about it when he joined up, but 2 weeks later, his block of flats got hit by a bomb. None of the residents survived." "Amazing," said Alice dryly. "Nobody knew that the Blitz was coming back then," retorted Carol. "Why don't you go and see what she says?" Anton asked Alice, visibly amused by the idea. "Don't be silly, we have a train to catch." "There's time. Go on, I'll pay for it." "No, really, I don't feel like hearing a lot of nonsense." "Leave Alice alone," said Sam. "Can't you see she's scared?" "Listen to the three of you. I'm not scared. I just don't believe in things like tarot cards and crystal balls. Besides, why are you all so interested in my future?" "Maybe one of them is secretly dreaming you'll end up in his bed," said Carol. Anton and Eddie looked stunned. Carol blushed and wished she hadn't said anything. "You could ask her if we're going to miss our train," added Sam, pretending not to have heard Carol's gaffe. "That way we can test her accuracy without having to wait too long." "Joke all you like," said Anton, "but unlike you, I believe in these things. If you go, I'll go after you." Alice's friends surrounded her. "You've all gone quite mad," she said, trying to push past them before finally giving up. "But since I'm dealing with 4 children bent on missing their train, I'll go and listen to whatever foolishness that woman has to say, and then we'll go home. How does that sound?" She held out her hand to Anton. "Are you giving me 2pence or what?" Alice went over to the caravan. A gust of wind made her lower her head, as though she had suddenly been forbidden to look the old woman in the eyes. Maybe Sam was right. The thought of having her future read bothered her more than she had expected. The woman invited Alice to take a seat on the stool across from her. Her eyes were large, her gaze penetrating. She never stopped smiling an eerie but enchanting smile. She had no crystal ball or tarot cards, just long, age-spotted hands that she extended, taking Alice's fingers in her own. When Alice touched them, a strange, gentle feeling filled her body, a comforting sensation of well-being that she hadn't known in a very, very long time. "I've seen you before, my girl," said the fortune-teller. "Ever since you started watching me just now, I imagine?" "I see. You don't believe in my gifts." "I'm a rational person," Alice replied. "No, you're an artist, an independent and free-thinking woman. Although it's true that your fears, what you call being a rational person, sometimes hold you back." "Why is everybody calling me a coward this evening?" "You didn't look very sure of yourself when you decided to come and see me." The fortune-teller leaned over and peered deep into Alice's eyes. Their faces were only inches apart. "Where have I seen those eyes before?" the old woman asked. "In a past life?" asked Alice. Visibly disturbed, but not by Alice's sarcasm, the fortune-teller suddenly sat up. "Ambergris, vanilla and leather," whispered Alice. "I beg your pardon?" "Your perfume. You love the East. I can read certain things about people too." "Ah, yes, you have a gift. It's true." She paused. "But what is more, you carry a story without even realizing it." "Don't you ever stop smiling?" asked Alice teasingly. "Is that how you lull your prey into a false sense of security?" "I know why you came to see me," the old woman continued, ignoring Alice's question. "It's funny when you think about it. You heard my friends daring me to do it? Well, yes, I did. But you're not an easy person to dare. Your friends have nothing to do with it." "What then?" "The solitude that haunts you and keeps you awake at night." "That doesn't sound very funny to me. Go on, tell me something astonishing. It's not that I don't enjoy your company, but I've got a train to catch." "No, it isn't funny. You're right." Her voice had grown quiet and thoughtful. She gazed into the distance, and Alice felt like she had been abandoned. "You were going to say something?" "What is funny," she said, speaking normally again, "is that the most important man in your life, the one you've been looking for without even knowing it, was walking behind you just a few moments ago." Alice couldn't resist the desire to turn around and look, but when she turned, she only saw her friends waving to say it was time to go. "Is it one of them?" Alice asked. "Eddie or Sam or Anton?" "Listen to me, Alice. Don't just hear what you want to hear. I told you that the man who will matter the most in your life was just behind you. He's not there anymore." "And where is my Prince Charming now?" "Patience, my girl. You'll have to meet 6 other people first." "6? That's an awful lot." "An amazing journey, I'd say. You'll understand one day. But it's late, and I've revealed everything you need to know. And since you don't believe a word I say, the consultation is free." "No, I'd rather pay." "No need. We'll call our time together a chat between old friends. I'm glad I got to see you, Alice. I wasn't expecting it. You're somebody very special, or at least your story is." "What story?" "We don't have time for that, and besides you won't believe me. Go on, or your friends will blame you for making them miss the train." They both fell silent, and then exchanged smiles before Alice returned to her friends. "You should see the look on your face. What did she tell you?" asked Anton. "I'll tell you later. Have you seen the time?" Alice hurried past them and toward the exit off the pier. "She's right," said Sam. "The train leaves in 20 minutes. They all began running. The ocean breeze mixed with a fine rain. Eddie took Carol by the arm. "Watch out, the ground is slippery," he said, leading her in the race for the station. The weak glow of the street lights led the way as they headed up the road. In the distance, they could see the lights of Brighton Station. They shouted to the railway official as they ran up to the platform. He held his lantern high and motioned for them to board the nearest carriage. The men helped the women up, and Anton was still on the running board when the train began to move forward. Eddie grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him inside. "A minute later and we would have missed it," gasped Carol. Eddie turned to Alice. "Poor thing, you're as white as a sheet," he said. Alice said nothing. Immersed in her thoughts, she watched Brighton disappear into the distance. She was thinking about what the woman had told her. "So, are you going to tell us about your glorious future?" asked Anton, interrupting her reverie. "After all, we almost had to sleep out in the cold because of you." "Because you stupidly goaded me," snapped Alice. "Did she tell you anything crazy?" asked Carol. "Nothing I didn't know already. Those people are just con artists. With a decent sense of observation, some intuition and self-assurance, you can string anybody along." "But you still haven't said what she told you," insisted Sam. Anton intervened out of mercy. "We've had a wonderful day. Let's leave it at that. I'm sorry, Alice. We shouldn't have insisted. You didn't want to, and we were all a little too silly. And I was the worst of us," apologized Alice in return, her voice softening. "But I have a much more pressing question. What are you all doing for Christmas Eve?" Carol was going to see her family in St. Mawes. Anton was having dinner with his parents in town. Eddie had promised his sister he'd spend the evening with her because his nephews were expecting Father Christmas, and his brother-in-law had already rented him a costume to wear. It was difficult to turn down because his brother-in-law had often helped Eddie out of a tight spot without ever telling Eddie's sister. Sam had been asked to lend a hand at a charity event that his boss had organised for the children in the Westminster orphanage. "What about you?" Anton asked Alice. "Oh, I've been invited to a party." "Where?" he insisted. Carol gave him a discreet kick in the shin before taking a packet of biscuits from her handbag and passing it around, proclaiming she was hungry as a horse. She glared at Anton as he nursed his wound in outraged silence. The train's acrid smoke swept across the platform as it pulled into Victoria Station. In the streets outside, a thick smog from the city's coal-burning fireplaces gripped the neighbourhood and floated in the depressed, yellowy glow of the sodium streetlights. They all took the same bus. Alice and Carol were the first to get off. They lived just a few streets apart from each other. "If you'd like," Carol said, as they were parting ways on Alice's doorstep. "I mean, if you change your mind about the party, you're welcome to spend Christmas with us in St. Mawes. My mother has wanted to meet you for such a long time. I often mention you in my letters, and she's intrigued to know more about what a nose does exactly." "Oh, I'm not very good at talking about what I do," said Alice, thanking Carol for the kind offer. She kissed her friend goodnight and headed upstairs. She could hear the footsteps of her neighbour, Mr. Daldry, on the staircase ahead of her, and waited a moment on the landing so she wouldn't run into him. It was almost as cold in her flat as it had been outside. Alice kept her coat and mittens on as she filled the kettle and put it on the gas, only to discover she was out of tea. She took a few dried rose petals from her work table and crumbled them into the teapot before pouring the hot water over them and settling into bed. She picked up the book she had abandoned the night before. Suddenly, the room went black. Alice put down her book, climbed up on her bed, and peered out of the skylight. The electricity had gone out in the entire neighbourhood. Often such cuts lasted until morning. She got down off the bed and stumbled round the flat, patting around in the dark, trying to find a candle, but the little stub of wax by the sink reminded her there were none left. She tried in vain to light its practically non-existent wick, but the flame only vacillated a moment before going out. How frustrating. Alice wanted to note down the ideas she had about the smells of the sea wind, the salt water, and the pilings eaten away by the spray. If she went to bed now, she would never fall asleep. She hesitated a moment before sighing and heading across the landing to ask her neighbour for help. Daldry came to the door, holding a candlestick. He was wearing cotton pyjama bottoms and a turtleneck sweater under a navy blue silk dressing gown. His face had a strange pallor in the glow of the candlelight. "I've been expecting you, Miss Pendelbury." "You've what?" she asked, startled. "Ever since the electricity went out. I don't sleep in these clothes, as you might imagine. Here's what you came for." He handed her an unlit candle. "I'm sorry, Mr. Daldry," she said sheepishly. "I'll be sure to buy some more and make it up to you." "I don't expect you will, Miss Pendelbury. You can call me Alice, you know." "Good night, then, Alice." Daldry closed his door, and Alice went back to her flat. A moment later there was a knock, and Alice opened the door to find Daldry standing there with a box of matches. "I suppose you'll be needing these too. You didn't have any matches last time, and since I'm going to bed now, I thought I'd make sure." Alice said nothing, but it was true that she had just used her last match. Daldry lit the wick of the candle he had given her. "Did I say something that offended you?" he said. "Why do you ask? You look so serious." "I'm sure it's just the shadows, Mr. Daldry." "If I'm to call you Alice, you should also know my Christian name. I'm Ethan, Very well. I'll call you Ethan, said Alice with a smile. Shadows or not, you look upset. I'm just tired from a long day. Then I'll leave you to sleep. Good night, Alice. Good night, Ethan.